Hello, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Whitty here, and I'm here to talk to you a little bit about some of the introductory concepts that you'll need to understand when you first start to learn how to program in Visual Basic. So we're going to start off today looking at a concept called assignment statements. And so assignment statements are those statements that we use in coding to assign values to variables or objects. And early on in Visual Basic programming, generally that means assigning values to properties of objects. So we've talked about things like a label or a text box. Those objects that you put on the screen, each one of those objects has its own properties associated with it. So there's the name property, there's the text property, there's the visible property, and all of those properties have values associated with them. So the visible property, for example, can be true or false. The text property can have any text that you want in it, and that's the text that gets displayed on that object when it's on the screen. The name property is what we use to reference that object when we're coding. And so each of these objects has their own property. And so when we are using assignment statements in Visual Basic with when we are using assignment statements in Visual Basic with these objects and their properties, we're simply using a syntax. And syntax is a word you're going to hear me talk about quite a bit in coding. And that is kind of the grammar rules or how we write the statements. And so the grammar rules to writing an assignment statement, at least at the beginning of Visual Basic coding, is object.property equals value. What object do you want to change? What property of that object do you want to change? And then what value do you want to assign to that property? So this value gets assigned to this property of the object that you're referencing in this assignment statement. So let's take a look at an example. So here we've got a simple example where we've got a variable, some sort of variable called x. Now x is not a very good variable name, and in programming we try to name things with much more accurate naming conventions. But for our simplicity purposes here, we've got this variable x. And what that means is, you can kind of look at it here. This means that we've got a space in memory, you can see that by the red box here, that is reserved for something that we're going to put in there. And we've given that space in memory a name. And we're going to look at declaring variables in a later video, but this is how we set up a variable. So once you've declared the variable, you now have that variable available and you have this space in memory available for it. Well, when we assign a value, when we say x is equal to 5, what we're actually doing here is we are assigning the value 5 to x. And this is what we call assignment. We are taking the value 5 and we're assigning it to x. So when we do that, it looks like this, where 5 gets kind of stored in that space in memory. It's got the name x, but anytime we refer to that, it actually is the value 5. And so we are assigning, using an assignment statement, 5 to the value x. In Visual Studio or in Visual Basic, the equal sign is the assignment operator. So this equal sign here is our assignment operator. It can also in Visual Basic mean to compare two things. It could say, if you're using it, for example, inside of an if statement, if we were to say if x equals 5, then do this, then it can also be used as a comparator. So it has a kind of a double use in Visual Basic. Other languages only use the equal sign as an assignment operator and use a double equal sign, for example, like Java uses a double equal sign as a comparison. So if you want to compare two things, is equal to, then you would use two equal signs beside each other. So to take the example one step further and look at an actual Visual Basic statement with an object and its property, okay, we're looking at object.property equals value. Our object is LBL age, so an age label. What property are we wanting to change? Well, we're wanting to change the text property. So we say LBL age.text object.property equals, and then the value that we want to assign to this. Okay, so the value is that value that we're trying to assign to this label. And so just if we look down here at the example, it's exactly the same thing. what happens is 17 gets assigned into the text property of the age label. And so here's an example of the assignment statements code that we were looking at. So you can see here right now it says your current age is, and then there's a label here called LBL age. That matches the LBL age that we were looking at in the video. And you can see that the text property, if we look at the text property, right now it says LBL age. But when we click on this button and we open up the code, you can see that I've put a code statement in here that says LBL age.text equals 17. And so what's happening here is we are assigning the value 17 to the text property of LBL age. So when we run our program and we click on that button, it's going to execute this line of code. Here it is. You can see LBL age. We click on display age and the value changes to 17 because the text property of this label has been changed to 17 because we have said LBL age.text equals 17. Here's a slightly different example, but it follows the same premise. And that is here we have txtdisplay.text equals hello. Now in this case, you'll notice something slightly different about this statement. The first two parts are the same, object.property equals, and then we have a value, but you'll notice that we have quotation marks around the value. And that is because we are using what's called a string literal. Anytime we want to put text into something, into a property of an object or into a variable, we have to do that using quotation marks. And what that means is that exactly what you see inside the quotation marks is what is going to get assigned to the text property of txtDisplay here. So just like we've seen in previous examples, that value gets moved over, and now the text property of txtDisplay will now be hello, and you should see hello on the text box, in the text box. So here's the practical example of that statement. You can see here we have txtDisplay. That's what the text property is of the text box. So we have our text box here. If we scroll down and look at our text property over here, you can see txtDisplay is the name of that, or is the text that is being displayed inside of that text box. That's also the name of the text box. You can see that over here. It's the name of the text box as well. And so when we go into our code window and we look here, we're doing exactly the same thing. txtDisplay.text equals hello world. And we talked about this concept of a string literal where you have a quotation mark surrounding both the beginning and the end. So you've got hello world in a quotation mark. So this is what we call a string literal. When we run the program, you'll notice that right now txtDisplay is showing in there, and if we click on display string, it changes the text to hello world. Now note, it doesn't matter what you have inside of this quotation mark, it is going to change and look exactly like that. So if I change this O to an A, and now I run my program, when I click on display string now, notice it's changed the O to an A. That is what's called a string literal. It's literally what's inside of that text box is going to be what's going to be displayed. So again, really quickly, I could change this to, instead of it saying hello world, I could make it say hello universe. And then when I run my program, when I'm ready to display the text, I click the button and it says hello universe this time. So that's assignment and string literals. Now, another concept that we have to know when we're looking at assignment statements and adding values to other objects is concatenation. Now, concatenation is just a really complicated term, complicated programming term that we use to basically mean to join two things together. So if we have two objects that are the same or different or whatever, and we want to join those two objects together in another object, we have to use what's called concatenation to join those two things together. And in order to do that, we want to use the AND symbol. So in Visual Basic, the AND symbol is our concatenator or our concatenation operator. So it joins two things on either side to the to each other. Okay, so let's look at an example of what that looks like. So here's an example that looks fairly similar to what we've already seen, except now the value looks a little bit different. It's a much longer line of code here. So you got object.property, txt_receipt.text equals, remember it's value or expression, and here we have a bit of an expression. And you'll notice that we've got a string literal. How do we know that? Because we've got these quotation marks. And then we're joining that using this concatenation symbol. So there's the concatenation symbol, and we're joining it to the text property of txt price. So whatever is inside of the text, the txt price text box as far as text, is going to get joined with your total price is, and then that's going to get stored in txt_receipt.text. So it's going to be displayed in the text property of txt_receipt. So you can see here, if we have a text box called txt_receipt, and this is the text property of it, when we execute this line of code, what's going to happen is it takes those two values and puts them together. So now it says your total price is, and then the 10 that was inside of the text box already here. Okay, so just to show you that one more time, right now the value of txt_price.text is 10. Over here you've got the string literal, your total price is, that's this part that's inside here. And we join them together using that concatenation symbol. And when we do that, both of them get combined together and you end up with your total price is 10. So that concludes our video for today. Thanks for watching. We will be looking at some more concepts, so please stay tuned for our next video. I hope that this was helpful, and we will see you in the next video.